Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. Lieutenant Ember Nightfall had seen some ridiculous things during her tenure as a xenobiologist aboard orbital research platform Nexus Prime. But nothing, and she meant absolutely nothing, could have prepared her for what was about to unfold on what should have been a perfectly ordinary monitoring shift. The Galactic Menagerie, as the facility was unofficially known throughout the Outer Rim territories, housed the most comprehensive collection of interspecies predators and their offspring in known space. Picture a zoo, but instead of harmless Earth pandas and sleepy lions, imagine crystalline hunters from Prism 4, whose bodies could refract light into deadly laser beams, shadow stalkers from the Void Nebula that existed in a state somewhere between matter and pure nightmare fuel, and plasma-breathing drachnids from Inferno Station that could melt through titanium hull plating with their morning yawns. Ember pressed a tissue to her nose and glared at her reflection in the observation deck's reinforced viewing portal. A cold. A simple, mundane, utterly human respiratory infection had followed her halfway across the galaxy. Apparently immune to the advanced medical technology that could regrow limbs and cure quantum cancer. The irony wasn't lost on her that she could analyze the behavioral patterns of creatures that defied every law of biology she'd learned in university, but couldn't shake a case of the sniffles. "The Zentorian delegation is arriving in 15 minutes, announced Chief Warden Blix, his forearms simultaneously checking data pads, adjusting environmental controls, and somehow managing to look perpetually stressed, despite lacking anything resembling human facial expressions. His species had evolved on a world where multitasking wasn't just useful. It was survival. Please tell me the feeding demonstration is ready." Research assistant Nix bounced on her heels with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested either genuine excitement or a concerning caffeine addiction. Her Altarian heritage meant she experienced emotions at roughly 3 times the intensity of most humanoids, which made her either the best or worst person to have around volatile alien predators, depending on your perspective. "Everything's perfect," Nix chirped, her voice carrying harmonics that made nearby equipment hum in sympathy. "The Prism Hunters are positioned in Habitat 12. The Shadow Stalkers are appropriately lurking in the darkness of Section 9, and the Drachnid cubs are absolutely adorable in their thermal containment units." Ember raised an eyebrow. Adorable wasn't typically how one described creatures whose idea of play involved practicing their ability to incinerate organic matter, but Nix had always possessed an unusual definition of cute. The observation deck offered a panoramic view of the facility's main habitats, each one a carefully constructed ecosystem designed to house creatures that could, individually or collectively, probably, conquer a small planet if they ever figured out how to work together. Fortunately, most apex predators weren't big on collaboration, a fact that made Ember's job significantly easier and the galaxy marginally safer. Habitat 12 sparkled with an otherworldly beauty as the Prism Hunters moved through their crystalline forest. These creatures looked like living gemstones, their faceted bodies catching and redirecting light in patterns that could hypnotize prey or, when focused properly, cut through starship hulls. Their cubs were smaller versions of their parents, still learning to control their refractive abilities, and occasionally setting small fires when they got excited. The Shadow Stalkers in Section 9 were harder to observe, existing as they did in a state that made quantum physicists weep and philosophers question the nature of reality. They appeared as shifting darkness with too many teeth, moving through shadows that shouldn't have existed under the habitat's carefully controlled lighting. Their young were like living nightmares in training, practicing their ability to induce existential dread in anything with a nervous system. And then there were the drachnids, massive, scaled creatures that breathed plasma instead of fire and considered molten metal a light snack. Their cubs were the size of small shuttlecraft and possessed an unfortunate tendency to accidentally melt their toys, their food, and occasionally their habitat walls when they got overly enthusiastic about playtime. "The VIP viewing gallery is filling up," Blix reported, his stress levels apparently reaching new heights as his secondary arms began fidgeting with his equipment harness. "We have representatives from the Galactic Council, 3 xenobiology research institutes, and someone from the Interspecies Safety Commission, who keeps asking about our insurance policies." Ember checked her chronometer and suppressed another sniffle. The feeding demonstration was a carefully choreographed event designed to showcase the natural behaviors of the facility's residents while maintaining the illusion of safety for the observers. Each species would receive their preferred sustenance, while their cubs learned hunting techniques through observation and mimicry, a process that had been refined over years of careful study and more than a few near-death experiences. "Initiating feeding sequence," Nyx announced with barely contained glee, her fingers dancing across the control interface, "beginning with Habitat 12. The prism hunters immediately perked up as automated feeders released their meal, crystallized nutrients that required the creatures to focus their light-bending abilities to properly digest. The adult hunters demonstrated the technique while their cubs watched with the intense concentration of students cramming for final exams. "Beautiful," murmured someone from the VIP gallery, and Ember had to admit they were right. The display of controlled energy, manipulation, was genuinely stunning, like watching living prisms conduct a symphony of light. The Shadow Stalkers received their feeding next, a process that involved releasing specially designed energy matrices into their habitat that they could absorb through their quasi-dimensional forms. The adults showed their young how to properly interface with the energy sources, a lesson that involved a lot of ominous shifting and what sounded suspiciously like whispered threats in languages that predated most civilizations. "And now for our drachnids," Nyx announced, her voice carrying across the observation deck with infectious enthusiasm. The thermal containment units in the drachnid habitat opened, releasing chunks of refined metals that had been heated to temperatures that would make stars jealous. The adult drachnids demonstrated proper plasma breathing technique, showing their cubs how to achieve the precise thermal output needed to properly process their meal. It was at this exact moment, with dozens of VIP observers watching, multiple recording devices capturing every detail, and the galaxy's most dangerous predator cubs paying rapt attention to their parents' demonstrations, that Ember felt the familiar tickle in her nasal passages that signaled an incoming sneeze. She tried to suppress it. Really, she did. But the combination of recycled air, stress, and what was probably the most inconveniently timed respiratory spasm in galactic history proved too much for her human physiology to handle. "Ah! Ah! Achoo!" The sound echoed through the observation deck's audio system, which was connected to the Habitat Monitoring Network, which broadcast to every single containment area throughout the facility. What happened next would later be described in official reports as an unprecedented xenobiological event of potentially catastrophic proportions. But in the moment, it looked like every single predator cub in the facility had suddenly been struck by lightning. They froze, all of them, simultaneously. The Prism Hunter cubs stopped mid-refraction, their light displays flickering like broken holograms. The Shadow Stalker young ceased their ominous shifting, becoming perfectly still patches of darkness that seemed to be listening intently. The drachnid cubs let their plasma breath die to barely glowing embers as they turned toward the observation deck with expressions that suggested they'd just heard the voice of their god. "That's unusual," Blix said, with the kind of understatement that would have been impressive if the situation weren't rapidly spiraling toward complete disaster. Then, one by one, the cubs began to copy the sound. It started with a small prism hunter cub, its crystalline body vibrating as it produced a surprisingly accurate approximation of Ember's sneeze. The sound rippled through the habitat's audio system, and immediately every other cub in every other habitat began attempting their own version. The shadow. Stalker Young made sounds that suggested sneezing while simultaneously questioning the fundamental nature of existence. The drachnid cubs produced sneezes that came out as small puffs of superheated plasma. Even species that shouldn't have been capable of making such sounds were somehow managing to approximate the noise with disturbing accuracy. "Turn off the audio feeds," Ember shouted, but it was too late. The sound had already propagated throughout the entire facility, and the cubs weren't just copying it, they were treating it like some kind of call. The adult predators were beginning to take notice, and their reactions ranged from confusion to alarm to what appeared to be genuine concern that their offspring had suddenly developed a new and inexplicable behavioral pattern. "What did you do?" Blix demanded, all four of his arms now working frantically at different control panels. "I sneezed," Ember protested, grabbing another tissue. "It's a perfectly normal human bodily function." "Normal for humans, maybe," Nyx said, her enthusiasm now tinged with what might have been panic. "But I don't think these cubs have ever heard anything like it before." The VIP gallery had gone completely silent. Dozens of alien dignitaries staring in fascination and horror as the galaxy's most dangerous predator species appeared to be teaching their young to mimic human respiratory functions. And then, just when Ember thought the situation couldn't possibly get any worse, she felt another tickle in her nose. "Oh no," she whispered. "Achoo!" This time, the response was immediate and coordinated. Every single cub in the facility sneezed in perfect unison, creating a cacophony of species-specific respiratory sounds that somehow harmonized into something that made the hair on the back of Ember's neck stand up. The adult predators stopped what they were doing and stared at their offspring with expressions that clearly conveyed a single, universal parental thought. "What the hell was that?" "I think," Nyx said slowly, her voice barely audible over the continuing chorus of alien sneezes, "we might have a problem." Ember looked out at the habitats, where creatures that had never shown interest in anything beyond hunting, eating, and sleeping were now focused entirely on the observation deck with an intensity that suggested they were waiting for something. The cubs continued their sneezing chorus, but now they were looking directly at her, as if expecting some kind of response or acknowledgement. "A problem," Ember repeated, watching as a drachnid cub managed to sneeze hard enough to melt a small section of its habitat wall. "I think we might have just accidentally declared myself the alpha predator of the entire facility." The implications of that statement hung in the air like a particularly ominous cloud, while somewhere in the distance the sound of more sneezing suggested that the situation was far from over. The aftermath of Ember's second sneeze was like watching a carefully orchestrated symphony suddenly decide to improvise jazz while the conductor was having a nervous breakdown. Every habitat monitor lit up with alerts as the facility's automated systems tried to process what they were witnessing. Unprecedented cross-species behavioral synchronization triggered by what the computers helpfully classified as unidentified vocalization pattern. "Status report," Blix barked, his forearms moving across control panels, with the desperate efficiency of someone trying to prevent a galactic incident. What are we looking at here? Nix's fingers flew across her data tablet, her Alterian physiology allowing her to process information at speeds that made most other species dizzy. "The cubs aren't just mimicking the sound," she reported, her voice carrying an edge of fascination that probably should have been pure terror. "They're incorporating it into their existing behavioral patterns. Look at Habitat 12. The prism hunter cubs had arranged themselves in a perfect formation, their crystalline bodies aligned to create a complex geometric pattern that focused their collective light-bending abilities into a single, concentrated beam aimed directly at the observation deck. But instead of their usual hunting displays, they were using their powers to create visual representations of sound waves, specifically the harmonic pattern of Ember's sneeze. "They're trying to communicate," Ember realized, pressing another tissue to her nose, while simultaneously trying to process the implications. They think the sneeze was some kind of message. In Habitat 9, the Shadow Stalker cubs had done something that made the facility's quantum physicists start frantically recalibrating their instruments. They'd somehow synchronized their dimensional phasing to create a collective shadow that spelled out what looked suspiciously like a phonetic approximation of Achoo in ancient Void script, a written language that shouldn't have existed since their species communicated through existential dread rather than conventional linguistics. But it was the Drachnid cubs that really drove home the severity of the situation. These creatures, whose idea of subtle communication involved setting things on fire, had managed to use their plasma breath to carve the sound pattern of the sneeze into the reinforced walls of their habitat. The thermal scarring created a visual representation of the audio waveform that was both scientifically impressive and deeply concerning from a containment perspective. "The adult predators are responding," Nix continued, her voice now carrying the kind of excitement that suggested she'd either made a groundbreaking discovery or was having a complete psychological break. "They're not just confused, they're deferential. Look at the behavioral indicators." Ember followed Nix's pointing finger and felt her stomach drop somewhere in the vicinity of her boots. The adult prism hunters, creatures that had never shown submission to anything except larger prism hunters, were lowering their crystalline heads in what was unmistakably a gesture of acknowledgement. The Shadow Stalkers had ceased their constant territorial shifting and were maintaining perfectly still positions that their species typically reserved for the presence of superior predators. Most disturbing of all, the adult drachnids, apex predators that considered small moons acceptable snack foods, were exhibiting behavior that their species profile explicitly stated was impossible. They were waiting for permission to continue their activities. "This is not good," Blix muttered, his stress levels apparently reaching heights that his species' evolutionary psychology hadn't prepared him for. "The containment protocols are designed for aggressive predators, not whatever this is." "What this is," said a new voice from the entrance to the observation deck, "is the most fascinating xenobiological phenomenon I've witnessed in 30 years of interspecies research." Dr. Orion Blackthorne strode into the chaos with the kind of calm confidence that suggested he either had a plan or was completely insane. His reputation as the galaxy's foremost expert in predator psychology preceded him like a particularly intimidating shadow, and his arrival meant that word of the situation had already reached the upper levels of the research hierarchy. "Dr. Blackthorne," Blix said, relief evident in his voice despite his species' typically stoic demeanor. "Thank the Void you're here. We have a situation that's completely outside our operational parameters." Orion moved to the main observation window, his keen eyes taking in the unprecedented scene below. "Indeed you do. And unless I'm very much mistaken, Lieutenant Ember here has just accomplished something that xenobiologists have been trying to achieve for decades. Which is? Ember asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew the answer. You've established yourself as an apex predator in the eyes of creatures from multiple star systems, Orion replied with the kind of academic enthusiasm that suggested he found the situation more intellectually stimulating than terrifying. That sneeze of yours has somehow triggered recognition protocols that transcend individual species boundaries. As if to emphasize his point, another wave of synchronized sneezing erupted from the habitats. But this time, the sound was different, more refined, more purposeful. The cubs weren't just copying the noise, they were harmonizing it, creating complex vocal arrangements that turned a simple human respiratory function into something that sounded suspiciously like an anthem. The frequency analysis is remarkable, Nix reported, her excitement now completely overriding any sense of appropriate caution. The sneeze hit a harmonic resonance that appears to be hardwired into the predator recognition centers of multiple species. It's like you accidentally spoke a universal language that says, "I am the thing that hunts the hunters." The implications of that statement hit Ember like a cargo hauler, traveling at relativistic speeds. She looked out at the habitats, where creatures that could individually devastate entire ecosystems were treating her like some kind of supreme predator, and felt the familiar tickle in her nasal passages that indicated her cold wasn't finished with her yet. "Oh no," she whispered, raising the tissue to her nose. "Don't you dare," Blix warned, but it was too late. Achoo! This time, the response was immediate and coordinated in a way that made the previous incidents look like warm-up exercises. Every single predator cub in the facility sneezed in perfect unison, but now their parents joined in, creating a cacophony of species-specific respiratory sounds that somehow harmonized into something that made the station's hull plating vibrate. More concerning, the adult predators weren't just participating, they were organizing. The prism hunters began moving into formation patterns typically reserved for pack hunts. The shadow stalkers started phase shifting in coordinated waves that created interference patterns in local space-time. The drachnids aligned themselves into what their behavioral profiles identified as a challenge formation. Except instead of preparing to fight something, they appeared to be preparing to follow it. "They're forming coalitions," Orion observed with the kind of scientific detachment that suggested he was either brilliant or completely divorced from reality. "Multi-species hunting groups. This is unprecedented." "Unprecedented and terrifying," Blix added, his multiple arms now working at a speed that created a blur of motion around the control panels. The containment systems aren't designed to handle coordinated behavior between different species. If they decide to work together, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the observation deck understood the implications. Individual predators were dangerous, but manageable. Coordinated groups of apex predators from different evolutionary backgrounds working together represented a threat level that the facility's safety protocols had never been designed to address. "The situation is spreading," Nix reported, her voice now carrying a note of genuine alarm. "I'm getting reports from other sections of the station. The audio from our habitats has been picked up by the facility's communication network. Every predator species in the entire complex is starting to exhibit similar behavioral changes." Ember felt another sneeze building and clamped her hand over her nose with desperate determination. "What do we do?" Orion turned from the observation window with an expression that suggested he'd either solved the problem or decided to embrace the chaos. "Well, Lieutenant, since you've accidentally established yourself as the alpha predator of what amounts to a small army Of the galaxy's most dangerous creatures, I suggest you start thinking like one. Meaning? Meaning, Orion said with a smile that was either reassuring or deeply unsettling. You're going to have to go down there and take control of your new pack before they decide to break out of containment and hunt something more interesting than processed food pellets. The sound of synchronized sneezing echoed through the facility once again, and Ember realized that her simple head cold had just become the most dangerous biological weapon in known space. The emergency klaxons began wailing approximately 30 seconds after Ember's third sneeze, which seemed like remarkably poor timing, considering the situation had already progressed well beyond the emergency phase and was now firmly entrenched in galactic incident territory. The sound mixed with the ongoing chorus of alien sneezes to create an audio landscape that would have made avant-garde composers weep with envy, and everyone else reach for the nearest sedative. Containment breach in Habitat 18, announced the facility's automated systems, with the kind of cheerful efficiency that suggested the computers hadn't quite grasped the severity of the situation. Please remain calm while emergency protocols are initiated. Habitat 18? Blix's voice cracked as he consulted his displays. That's the Nebula Prowlers. They've never shown aggressive behavior toward containment systems before. Dr. Orion moved to the tactical display with the measured pace of someone who'd seen enough xenobiological crises to know that panic was rarely productive. They're not being aggressive, he corrected, studying the readouts with professional interest. They're being helpful. Look at the breach pattern. The Prowlers, sleek, ethereal creatures that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that made mathematicians question their career choices, had indeed breached their containment. But instead of escaping, they were using their dimensional manipulation abilities to create temporary passages between habitats, allowing the other predator species to communicate more directly. They're networking, Nyx breathed, her Altarian emotional sensitivity picking up on behavioral patterns that the monitoring systems couldn't quantify. The cubs aren't just responding to the alpha call. They're organizing a proper pack structure across species lines. Ember watched in fascination and growing horror as creatures that had never shown interest in anything beyond their own territorial boundaries began coordinating their movements with the precision of a military operation. The Prism Hunters were using their light-bending abilities to create communication beams between habitats. The Shadow Stalkers were phase-shifting information through dimensional channels that bypass the facility's monitoring systems entirely. Even the Drachnids, typically the least subtle creatures in known space, were using controlled plasma bursts to send thermal signals to their counterparts in other sections. Status report from the Outer Rim habitats, called a technician from across the observation deck. The Void Whispers are exhibiting unprecedented vocal activity, and the Crystal Serpents have begun synchronized movement patterns that are overloading their habitat's structural supports. How many species are we talking about? Orion asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be reassuring. All of them, Blix replied, with the hollow tone of someone watching their career prospects evaporate in real time. Every single predator species in the facility is exhibiting coordinated behavior patterns. The cubs are leading the organization, but the adults are following their lead. The tactical display updated to show a facility-wide overview, and the sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Creatures from dozens of different worlds, each evolved to be the apex predator of their respective ecosystems, were moving in perfect synchronization. It was like watching a symphony orchestra composed entirely of instruments designed to kill things, all following the conductor's baton. Except the conductor was a human xenobiologist with a head cold. "We need to contact Galactic Command," Blix continued, his multiple arms working frantically at communication arrays. "This situation is beyond our containment capabilities." "Already tried," reported another technician. "Communication systems are being jammed by some kind of harmonic interference. It's like the creatures are generating a collective signal that's disrupting our transmission arrays." Ember felt another sneeze building and desperately tried to suppress it, but the combination of stress, alien atmospherics, and what was probably the most inconveniently persistent cold in galactic history proved too much for her human physiology. "Achoo!" The response was immediate and absolutely terrifying. Every single creature in the facility, cubs and adults alike, sneezed in perfect unison, but this time the sound carried harmonic overtones that made the station's hull plating ring like a bell. More concerning, the synchronized sneeze seemed to trigger some kind of collective decision-making process. The creatures began moving with purpose. "They're converging on the central hub," Nyx reported, her voice carrying a mixture of scientific fascination and existential dread. "All species, all age groups. They're abandoning their individual territories and moving toward the main observation areas." "Toward us," Ember realized with growing alarm. "Toward their alpha," Orion corrected, his academic excitement apparently overriding any sense of personal safety. "This is remarkable. You've triggered the formation of a superpack that transcends evolutionary boundaries. The behavioral implications are staggering." "The security implications are also pretty staggering," Blixie pointed out with admirable understatement. "These creatures could tear through the station's hull like tissue paper if they decided to work together." As if summoned by his words, the first of the predators appeared in the corridor outside the observation deck. A group of prism hunter cubs moved with liquid grace, their crystalline bodies refracting the corridor lighting into patterns that spelled out what looked suspiciously like "Greetings, Alpha," in ancient Terran script, a language they shouldn't have known existed. They were followed by Shadow Stalker Young that manifested as patches of darkness that somehow conveyed respectful attention, and Drachnid cubs that had managed to reduce their plasma output to levels that wouldn't immediately incinerate everything in their vicinity, a feat of self-control that their species profile indicated was theoretically impossible. "They're not being aggressive," Nyx observed with wonder. "They're presenting themselves for inspection. It's like they're reporting to their pack leader." "That's exactly what they're doing," Orion confirmed, his eyes bright with the kind of intellectual excitement that suggested he'd either made the discovery of a lifetime or was about to become the subject of a very interesting obituary. "The sneeze has triggered recognition protocols that identify you as not just an alpha predator, but a super alpha. They're treating you like the evolutionary apex of all predator species." The corridor outside was filling with creatures that represented the most dangerous life forms from across the galaxy. But instead of the chaos and violence that should have accompanied such a gathering, there was an eerie sense of order. The different species maintained respectful distances from each other, while all focusing their attention on the observation deck, specifically on Ember. "This is getting out of hand," she muttered, reaching for another tissue. "Don't sneeze again," Blix warned, with the desperate tone of someone watching reality collapse around him. "Every time you do that, they become more organized." "I can't help it," Ember protested. "It's a biological function. I don't have conscious control over—" "Achoo!" The synchronized response from the assembled creatures was so perfectly coordinated that it created a harmonic resonance that made the observation deck's windows vibrate. But more than that, the collective sneeze seemed to trigger some kind of communication protocol that allowed the different species to understand each other. The prism hunters began creating light patterns that the shadow stalkers somehow interpreted and responded to with dimensional shifts that the drachnids read as thermal signatures. It was like watching the birth of a universal translator based entirely on respiratory functions. "They're sharing information," Nix reported with barely contained amazement. "Hunting strategies, territorial knowledge, behavioral patterns. The sneeze isn't just establishing pack hierarchy, it's creating a communication network. A network of apex predators from multiple star systems," Orion added thoughtfully, "each species contributing their unique evolutionary advantages to a collective intelligence that could theoretically—" He trailed off, his expression shifting from excitement to something approaching alarm. "Could theoretically what?" Ember demanded. "Hunt anything in the galaxy," he finished quietly. "You've accidentally created the ultimate predator coalition. If they ever decided to leave this facility and work together in the wild—" The implications hung in the air like a particularly ominous storm cloud. A coordinated hunting pack, composed of creatures from dozens of different worlds, each contributing unique abilities and evolutionary advantages, could potentially challenge anything in known space. Planets, star systems, entire civilizations. Nothing would be safe from a coalition of super predators working in perfect harmony. "Status report from Galactic Command," called a technician who had somehow managed to break through the harmonic interference. "They're demanding immediate containment of the situation. If we can't restore normal behavioral patterns within 6 hours, they're authorizing a full facility lockdown and quarantine of all personnel." "Quarantine?" Blix's voice rose to a pitch that his species probably wasn't designed to achieve. "For how long?" "Indefinitely," came the grim response. "They're treating this as a potential threat to galactic security." Ember looked out at the assembled creatures, all of whom were watching her with the kind of patient attention that suggested they were waiting for orders, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a particularly heavy blanket made of pure dread. "So," she said slowly, "let me make sure I understand the situation." I sneezed, accidentally convinced the galaxy's most dangerous predators that I'm their supreme leader. And now I have 6 hours to fix this before we're all locked up forever. "That's a remarkably concise summary," Orion agreed. "And if I can't restore normal behavior patterns, then you'll be remembered as the human who created the most dangerous hunting pack in galactic history," he replied with the kind of academic objectivity that suggested he found the prospect more intellectually stimulating than personally terrifying. Ember felt another sneeze building and realized that her next respiratory spasm might determine the fate of civilizations across known space. The assembled predators waited with perfect patience, their collective attention focused entirely on their accidental alpha. "No pressure," she muttered, and prepared to either save the galaxy or accidentally conquer it, one sneeze at a time. The next hour unfolded like a master class in controlled chaos, assuming such a thing could exist when dealing with creatures capable of reshaping matter at the molecular level. Ember had reluctantly accepted her role as the galaxy's most unlikely alpha predator, which meant she now had to think like something that could theoretically hunt starships for sport while suffering from what was probably the most inconveniently timed head cold in recorded history. "All right," she announced to the assembled crowd of xenobiologists, technicians, and one increasingly frazzled Zentarian administrator, "if I'm going to be the alpha of this interspecies nightmare, we're going to do this scientifically." Dr. Orion had produced a portable behavioral analysis unit that looked suspiciously like something designed for battlefield conditions rather than academic research. "The key," he explained while calibrating sensors that could measure everything from pheromone levels to quantum fluctuations, is understanding that you've accidentally triggered an evolutionary recognition pattern that transcends individual species development. These creatures aren't just following you, they're recognizing you as the theoretical ultimate predator that their species have been evolutionarily programmed to either challenge or submit to. Wonderful, Ember muttered, watching as more creatures continued to arrive in the central hub. The latest arrivals included a group of phase hunters from the Epsilon sector whose bodies existed in a constant state of quantum uncertainty, and a pack of void stalkers that looked like living geometry with too many teeth. So I'm not just their leader. I'm their evolutionary boogeyman made manifest. Precisely, Orion agreed, with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he was having the time of his life. Which means you can use that recognition pattern to gradually redirect their behavior back toward normal parameters. The plan, such as it was, involved a carefully orchestrated series of controlled sneezes designed to slowly modify the pack hierarchy and return authority to the natural parent-offspring relationships. It was like conducting a symphony orchestra, except the instruments were apex predators, and a single wrong note could result in the accidental conquest of several star systems. Beginning Phase 1, Nyx announced from her position at the monitoring station. Ember, try to sneeze with approximately 30% less intensity than your previous vocalizations. Ember stared at her. You want me to sneeze quietly? Relatively speaking, Orion confirmed. The goal is to gradually reduce the dominant signals while maintaining enough authority to prevent the pack structure from collapsing into chaos. The assembled creatures waited with the kind of patient attention that suggested they were prepared to follow her lead, regardless of how ridiculous the situation became. Ember took a deep breath, focused on the tickle in her nasal passages, and attempted what was probably the most precisely calibrated sneeze in galactic history. Ah, Achoo. The response was immediate, but noticeably different. The creatures still sneezed in unison, but the harmonic resonance was softer, less overwhelming. More importantly, several of the adult predators began showing signs of returning parental authority, gently nudging their cubs back toward more species-appropriate behaviors. Excellent, Orion observed, studying his readouts with professional satisfaction. The dominance hierarchy is becoming more flexible. The cubs are still acknowledging you as the supreme alpha, but they're beginning to recognize their parents as intermediate authorities. Phase 2, Nyx called out. This time, try to incorporate some kind of dismissive gesture, along with the sneeze. Something that suggests you're granting permission rather than issuing commands. Ember felt like she was participating in the galaxy's most dangerous game of charades, but the lives of everyone on the station, and potentially the security of multiple star systems, depended on her ability to communicate complex social hierarchies through respiratory functions and hand gestures. She raised her hand in what she hoped was a suitably authoritative dismissive wave and sneezed again, this time with even less intensity. The results were remarkable. The creatures began moving back toward their original territories, but they did so in an organized fashion that maintained the communication networks they'd established. The cubs started responding to their parents' calls again, but only after what appeared to be confirming glances toward the observation deck. It's working, Blix reported, with the first genuine relief he'd shown since the crisis began. Containment systems are registering normal territorial behaviors in approximately 60% of the habitats. The key insight, Orion explained while documenting everything with the thoroughness of someone who knew they were witnessing history, is that you're not trying to eliminate the pack structure. You're modifying it to incorporate the existing family units. The cubs still recognize you as the ultimate authority, but they're learning to accept their parents as your designated representatives. The process continued for the next several hours, with Ember gradually reducing the intensity and frequency of her sneezes while incorporating increasingly complex behavioral cues. She felt like she was learning to speak a language composed entirely of controlled respiratory spasms and interpretive dance, which was definitely not covered in any xenobiology curriculum she'd ever encountered. But the most remarkable development wasn't the return to normal behavior patterns. It was what the creatures had learned during their brief period of interspecies cooperation. The communication networks they'd established didn't disappear entirely. Instead, they evolved into something more sophisticated, a voluntary information sharing system that allowed different species to coordinate their activities without abandoning their individual territorial requirements. Look at Habitat 12, Nix pointed out with growing excitement. The prism hunters are using their light manipulation abilities to create navigation beacons for the shadow stalkers. They're helping each other optimize their hunting patterns. And the drachnids in Section 15 are using controlled thermal outputs to create environmental modifications that benefit the phase hunters, Orion added. They're maintaining the cooperative behaviors, but within the context of their natural social structures. Ember watched the displays with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. The creatures were demonstrating levels of interspecies cooperation that xenobiologists had theorized about for decades, but never observed in practice. Her accidental alpha status had somehow unlocked dormant social behaviors that allowed apex predators to work together without losing their individual species identities. "Final phase," she announced, preparing for what she hoped would be her last deliberately controlled sneeze of the day. "Time to officially retire from my position as supreme predator of the galaxy." This sneeze was different from all the others. Instead of the sharp, commanding sound that had initially established her dominance, Ember produced something that sounded almost grateful. It was a sneeze that conveyed acknowledgement, appreciation, and gentle dismissal all at once. The creature's response was perfect. They sneezed in unison one final time, but the sound carried harmonics of farewell and respect rather than submission. Then, gradually, they began returning to their normal activities, hunting, playing, caring for their young, but with an awareness of their neighbors that hadn't existed before. "Remarkable," Orion breathed, studying the final behavioral readouts. "You've essentially taught them to maintain beneficial cooperative behaviors while preserving their natural social structures. This could revolutionize our understanding of interspecies communication and behavioral modification." "Status report from Galactic Command," called the communications technician. "They're requesting confirmation that the crisis has been resolved and normal containment protocols have been restored." "Tell them," Ember said, reaching for what she hoped would be her final tissue of the day, "that the situation is under control. The creatures are exhibiting enhanced cooperative behaviors within normal parameters, and there's no longer any threat to galactic security." She paused, considering the implications of what they'd accomplished. "Also, tell them that we're going to need to completely revise our understanding of predator psychology and interspecies behavioral dynamics." "And the facility?" Blix asked, his stress levels finally beginning to return to manageable ranges. "The facility," Ember replied with a smile, "is about to become the premier research center for cooperative predator behavior studies. We've accidentally stumbled onto something that could change how we approach conservation, behavioral modification, and interspecies relations across the galaxy." As if to emphasize her point, a group of prism hunter cubs created a light display that clearly spelled out, "Thank you, Alpha," in perfect Terran script, while their parents looked on with what could only be described as pride. "There's just one problem," Nix pointed out with a grin. "What happens the next time someone on the station gets a cold?" Ember felt a familiar tickle in her nasal passages and realized that her cold was finally beginning to clear up, just as she'd mastered the art of therapeutic sneezing. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Well," she said, settling into her new role as the galaxy's first accidental alpha specialist, "I suppose we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Right now, I have a feeling I'm going to be very busy. Apparently, there's a space station in the Outer Rim where someone's hiccups have convinced a colony of telepathic plants that humans are their long-prophesied gardener gods." She looked out at the habitats, where creatures from across the galaxy were demonstrating that even apex predators could learn to play nicely together when properly motivated by human respiratory functions, and couldn't help but laugh. "Just another day in xenobiology," she muttered, and prepared for whatever ridiculous crisis the universe would throw at her next. The galaxy, it seemed, was full of surprises, and most of them involved humans accidentally becoming the leaders of things they had no business leading. But if her experience with the Great Sneeze incident had taught her anything, it was that sometimes the most unlikely solutions came from the most mundane problems. After all, who would have thought that a simple head cold could revolutionize interspecies relations across known space?